This is a demo of the Purchase Invoice Import add-on for Dynamics 365 Business Central by Lighthouse Experts Group. The Purchase Invoice Import allows you to do a bulk import of purchase invoices or purchase credit memos into Business Central from a regular Excel file. And there's no need to follow a template. You decide what fields you want to import, you decide in what order you want those fields, and the import will take care of getting all the values into the right places in Business Central. The import will also perform all the necessary validations to make sure that any required fields have been entered, all the codes are valid, all the dimensions values exist, and so on. So let me start by showing how to set up the Excel file with your invoices, and then we'll run the import to see how the invoices get created in the system. So if you don't have it already, the first step is to get the list of available fields, and you can get that from our website, which is lighthouseexperts.com. And when you navigate to our website, just look for the Purchase Invoice Import link in the top level navigation. And if you click on that, it'll take you to a page where you'll see instructions and more information related to everything I'm going to show you today. So we don't need this right now. The only thing we need from here is the link to download the list of available fields, which is right here. And when you click on that link, it'll open up a shared Google Drive folder. And you don't need a Google account to be able to access this. So all you need to do is hit the download button on that file. And once the file is downloaded, just go ahead and open it. And so you'll see some instructions here at the top, but the important thing to notice is the field name column, which is column A, and the fact that some of these are in red. And so the red ones are the required fields. So the first column in this file will just have all the available field names that you can use in your import. The second column tells you if it's a header field or a line field. So when it gets into Business Central, there's a header area for the purchase invoice and there's an area with the lines. This just tells you which area that field happens to be in. The third column tells you if it's a required field or not. The fourth column is the data type. And you can have different data types. The first one is option. So if it's an option data type, it'll tell you in the notes what are all the available options for that field separated by a slash. So in this case, for the document type, we can see that there's two options, either invoice or credit memo. Whereas for the type field, you might have additional options. So like GL account, item, resource, fixed asset, and so on. When it's a date or a decimal, that's pretty straightforward. When it's a text or a code field, it'll tell you within brackets what is the maximum amount of characters that you can have for that field. So for example, the buy from vendor number is a 20-character maximum code field, whereas the vendor invoice number can be up to 35 characters. And for all the other fields, the notes column will just give you a little bit more information as to what's the purpose of that field and what it does in Business Central. But of course, you can also find more information in the Business Central help pages. So let's go ahead and start filling in our template file or our import file. To do this, I will start by copying and pasting all the required fields because I know I'm going to need them. So I'll get all of these in here from the beginning. When it comes to vendor invoice number and vendor credit memo number, either one of them is required, but not both at the same time. So it really depends on your document type, because the document type can either be invoice or credit memo. So I'll create a few lines for invoices, and I'll create a couple of credit memo lines. But the point is, when it's an invoice, you would need to fill in the vendor invoice number, and when it's a credit memo, you will fill in the vendor credit memo number. But you don't need to have both at the same time. So type, number, and direct unit cost. Now, in addition to these, there's a couple of fields that I may like to add personally. So one of them is quantity, and maybe I'll add a description field. Only thing to be careful for here is if you're typing the header names manually like I am, you just want to make sure that they match what is in the field name list over here. If you mistype one of these header lines, you'll get an error message because the import won't be able to recognize which field you're referring to. And then in terms of dimensions, there's a list of dimensions down here going from shortcut dimension 1 to 8. You can either copy paste these in just like I have done over here, and I'll just use the first 2 dimensions for my example. But you can also type in the actual dimension code. So within Business Central, if you go to General Ledger Setup, you can see what dimensions are set up as shortcut dimensions. So in my case, I have department and customer group. And if you like, you can actually use the code for the dimension instead of shortcut dimension 1 code or shortcut dimension 2 code. So in this case, because department is my shortcut dimension 1, I can type department. It doesn't even have to be capitalized. It can be typed like this, or I can just use the regular shortcut dimension 2 field name. Now let's start filling this in. So in my demo database, I know I have vendor numbers going from 10,000 to 50,000. So I'll just say that these 3 lines relate to the first vendor. These are for the second vendor, and maybe 1 more invoice with the third vendor. Posting date, I'll just use today's date. And just to make it easy for myself, I'll use the same date all the way down. Now, vendor invoice number, I'll use test 01 for the first one. But the important thing to notice is that I'm grouping all my lines for the same invoice together. And you have to do this because whenever the vendor invoice number changes, that's how the import knows to create a new document. So if this is test 02 and this is test 03, as the import goes through these lines one by one, once it hits this line, it'll detect that there was a change to the vendor invoice number. And so it'll know that this line belongs on a brand new invoice. And same over here. So it'll enter these 2 lines on that second invoice. Once it gets here, it'll see that the vendor number changes again, and it'll create a third invoice. So that's the reason why you need your invoice lines to be grouped together so that the import can properly detect when it's time to create a new document. As for the credit memos, the important thing here is that you fill in the vendor credit memo number. So you could see that for invoice types, I filled in the vendor invoice number, and for credit memo types, I filled in the vendor credit memo number. Now, type can be one of GL account, fixed asset, item, and so on. I'm just going to use GL accounts to keep it simple. But of course, you could have an item in here, you could have a fixed asset, or whatever you normally use on your invoices. And the number field relates to whatever type you've selected in here. So for GL account, it's an account from the chart of accounts. And there's a couple of numbers that I know I can use here. But if it was an item, you would be putting in an item number. If it was a fixed asset, you would put in a fixed asset number. Quantity can be left blank because if you leave it blank, it'll default it to 1. So you can type in a quantity if you have one, and if you don't have one, it'll just default it to 1. Direct unit cost is the amount, but in the case of like items, for example, it would just multiply your quantity by your direct unit cost to get the line amount. In my case, because it's all GL accounts, I'll just keep this simple. So I'll create, a simple amount on each line. Description is optional because if you leave it blank, it'll actually default from the description of the master data record. So in this case, if I don't put in a description, it'll default the GL account name for this account number from the chart of accounts. If it's a fixed asset or an item, you'll get by default the fixed asset description or the item description. But if you have a description, obviously you can type it in. And that would override whatever default the system would have put in there if you left it blank. For department and customer group, I actually need to look up the available values. So I'll quickly hop over to the dimensions page. Looks like the department can be administration, production, sales, and the customer group is large, medium, and small. So for the department, just put in admin, sales, and maybe large and small for the customer group. Okay, so again, this is just my personal template that I've created, but Each individual user will decide which fields are relevant to them, which fields they want to use in their import, and they can choose the ordering of the fields in their files. So for example, if I don't like the description here, I could easily move it to wherever I want. And the import will dynamically adjust to whatever template it sees in your file. So that means different users can use different layouts, or the same user can actually set up different templates depending on the types of invoices they want to import. So maybe certain types of invoices, I want to make sure I import a description and a quantity, whereas maybe on other types of invoices, I don't need those fields. So I can actually maintain multiple templates for different types of invoices, depending on what's more convenient for me. And so this allows users to focus on the fields that are relevant to them in their import file without worrying about all the additional fields on the Business Central application. And if there's a custom field or some other non-standard field you'd like to use in your import, just let us know and we can add it to the import so that it knows where to put your custom field on the invoice line. So for example, in the US localization of Business Central, there's a field on the invoice line called IRS 1099 liable, whereas this field doesn't exist in other localizations. And I know that in the British localization, there are VAT fields that exist on the lines that don't exist in other localizations. So if you would like to import these fields that are either custom from a partner or from an extension that you've installed, or maybe they only exist within your local area or your localization of Business Central, let us know and we can add that to the import so that you can use them as available fields, just like you could with any of the base fields that we've seen today. So now that we have our import file filled in, let's run the import in Business Central. So first thing I'll do is I'll save this. I'll just save it as book 1, and then I'll close out of it. And then when we hop back in Business Central, we just use the magnifying glass and I can run the purchase invoice import. It'll ask you to select an Excel file. So I'll do that with the ellipsis button, and then I have to click the choose button to select the file. Once I've selected the file, I hit OK, and it'll go through importing every single one. I know that was really quick, but I hope you're able to see that the import will show you a progress, and it'll show the actual vendor invoice numbers being imported one by one, so you can track the progress of your file if you have a very large file. Once it's done, it'll say the import was successful and the number of lines that it imported. So these 9 lines just correspond to the same 9 lines that we created in our import file. I'll hit OK. And then if I hop over to the purchase invoice list, we can see here are the 3 invoices that it created. So I'll open up each one. So the first one had 3 lines, and you could see that for the first one, we didn't enter a description, so it got defaulted from the GL account name. And the second 2 lines had descriptions, along with our amounts and our dimensions here at the end. Our second invoice had 2 lines. So here are the 2 lines on the second invoice. And the third invoice had another 2 lines. So here's the third invoice. And if I hop over to the purchase credit memo list, we should see that there was a credit memo created with an additional 2 lines. So as you can see, this tool can be useful for organizations who enter more than 10 or 15 invoices into Business Central every week, because now you can create invoices in a few seconds versus a few hours. And if there's additional functionality that you need for your specific business requirements that aren't part of the base purchase invoice import, let us know and we can customize the add-on to work however you would like for your specific business requirements. And if you want to see a live demo or ask any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@lighthouseexperts.com.